when he was stuck creatively. He would come into the room, in my room in the house, and he would say, "Has anything interesting happened to you lately?" So I knew he was stuck. He was looking for something to do. But I grew up.
They shared the same set, the same spotlight, and the same historic success. To the audience, Carroll O'Connor and Rob Reiner appeared to be the perfect on-screen clash on All in the Family. But behind the laughter, something far darker was unfolding. They didn't simply disagree, they barely tolerated one another. The tension quickly became personal. The attacks grew so intense that production was forced to halt, and the show's creator had to step in. Stay with me as we uncover what really happened on that set. Because once you learn the truth, you'll be stunned by how much hatred was hiding in plain sight. It all began with the first line Rob Reiner crossed. Many people believe Carroll O'Connor and Rob Reiner were close friends, trusted colleagues who grew together through years of collaboration. That belief is wrong. Long before the public sensed any friction, the two men had already become enemies. By the time All in the Family premiered in January 1971, O'Connor was a seasoned actor with decades of experience in theater, film, and television. To him, every gesture mattered. Every line carried meaning. Acting was never activism. It was interpretation. Rob Reiner entered the show from a completely different place. Younger, politically outspoken, and deeply influenced by the social upheaval of the late 1960s, Reiner viewed All in the Family not just as entertainment, but as a cultural weapon. His character, Michael Meathead Stivic, wasn't merely Archie Bunker's son-in-law. He was designed as Archie's ideological opposite. That was why the real rupture came early. During rehearsals, O'Connor noticed something that immediately raised red flags. Reiner didn't wait for direction. He interrupted table reads. He challenged line deliveries. To O'Connor, this wasn't collaboration. It was confrontation. And more than once, rehearsals came to a standstill because Reiner openly challenged the moral framing of a scene. He insisted that Archie had to be unmistakably wrong, not complex, not human, not layered. O'Connor reacted immediately. To him, Reiner wasn't refining the script. He was controlling it. On several occasions, O'Connor stopped rehearsals entirely, fixed his gaze on Reiner, and refused to continue until the tension in the room cooled. The message was clear: you do not control this set. From that point forward, something between them solidified, and not in a good way. Years later, O'Connor described it bluntly. Reiner didn't behave like a fellow actor. He behaved like a judge. In O'Connor's view, Reiner erased the boundary between performance and personal belief. He wasn't just arguing with Archie Bunker. He was arguing with Carroll O'Connor himself. And that was a line O'Connor never forgot. 7 years of resentment simmered beneath America's favorite sitcom. As All in the Family became the most-watched show on television, Norman Lear began to recognize that the friction between O'Connor and Reiner wasn't fading, it was intensifying. Lear later acknowledged that the ideological conflict driving the series didn't end with the script. It followed the actors onto the soundstage, into rehearsals, and occasionally into moments where production stalled entirely. Jean Stapleton, who portrayed Edith Bunker, later admitted privately that the atmosphere between O'Connor and Reiner was tense but restrained. She noticed how O'Connor would physically pull back whenever Reiner spoke off script, leaning away, folding his arms, avoiding eye contact. These were quiet acts of resistance. O'Connor was deliberately shutting Reiner out, right in front of everyone. Reiner, however, refused to retreat. He consistently challenged scenes he believed softened Archie's bigotry. In script discussions, Reiner argued that Archie needed to be exposed, corrected, and clearly defeated every time. O'Connor pushed back fiercely. He believed Archie's strength came from being familiar and recognizable, not publicly shamed. When Reiner once again questioned O'Connor's line delivery, O'Connor halted the run-through mid-scene. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply turned toward Norman Lear and said nothing. The silence stretched on. Cameras kept rolling. The crew froze. Lear later admitted that moment forced him to intervene and reassert control. Without speaking a word, O'Connor had drawn a boundary. He felt boxed in by Reiner's relentless ideological pressure. Where Reiner saw moral conviction, O'Connor felt personal judgment. To him, Reiner wasn't acting alongside him, he was acting against him. That belief never faded. Years later, O'Connor summarized his resentment in one of his most frequently quoted remarks. Rob always thought he was smarter than everyone else. To O'Connor, this wasn't confidence, it was the root of the problem. He believed Reiner didn't respect the craft of acting. He used it as a weapon, and O'Connor found that unforgivable. The hostility deepened as Reiner's reputation in the press grew. Critics increasingly praised Michael Stivic as the voice of reason, while Archie Bunker was framed as the obstacle standing in the way of progress. O'Connor read those reviews carefully, and he absorbed every word. To him, Reiner wasn't just winning debates within the story. He was winning them in the culture at large. And O'Connor believed the price was the erosion of Archie Bunker's humanity. In private, O'Connor finally reached his limit. Late in life, he said in an interview, without pause, "I've worked with many people I couldn't stand, but Rob topped them all." The statement was definitive. And yet the irony remains brutal. All in the Family became iconic precisely because the conflict was genuine. The confrontations between father-in-law and son-in-law felt volatile because they were. The anger carried weight because it wasn't scripted. It was lived. The audience laughed. The network celebrated. And every day, two men walked onto the same set fully aware that they despised each other. When the applause faded and the cameras stopped, the question was no longer whether the conflict had been real. It was whether it could exist without an audience. The answer arrived quickly. The feud outlived the series itself. When All in the Family officially ended in 1979, many at CBS quietly assumed distance would dissolve the hostility between Carroll O'Connor and Rob Reiner. It didn't. It simply lost its spectators. O'Connor moved straight into Archie Bunker's place, carrying the character forward while leaving Reiner behind. Off-camera, he appeared noticeably lighter, more relaxed, something Gene Stapleton later noted in private. But whenever Reiner's name surfaced, O'Connor's tone hardened instantly. The resentment hadn't disappeared. It had settled. By the early 1980s, the two men occupied completely separate worlds in Hollywood. O'Connor turned toward dramatic television, eventually reshaping his public image with In the Heat of the Night in 1988. Reiner, meanwhile, reinvented himself behind the camera, earning widespread acclaim with This Is Spinal Tap in 1984 and Stand By Me in 1986. Their paths no longer crossed, but the bitterness remained with O'Connor. In interviews throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he refused to rewrite history. He rejected the idea that the feud had been exaggerated or misunderstood. When pressed, he dismissed the phrase, creative differences, arguing it softened what he believed was sustained personal disrespect. Rob Reiner, by contrast, stayed largely silent. He did not dispute O'Connor's account. He did not pursue public reconciliation. Those close to Reiner described his silence as intentional. He had moved on, professionally and emotionally. They never shared a stage again. They never publicly acknowledged each other's success. The conflict did not heal. It did not resolve. It simply froze, unchanged, suspended, waiting for nothing. A death ended nothing between them. When Carroll O'Connor died on June 21, 2001, at the age of 76, Hollywood paused. Networks replayed All in the Family. Critics revisited Archie Bunker's legacy. Former colleagues spoke of O'Connor's discipline, intelligence, and moral seriousness. The industry mourned a giant. But one voice stood out for its restraint. Rob Reiner did not step forward with any public gesture of reconciliation. There was no attempt to revise the past, no reflection on their turbulent years together beyond acknowledging O'Connor's importance to television history. What Reiner offered was respect, professional, measured, and limited. That restraint carried weight. Reiner neither rewrote history nor challenged O'Connor's long-held resentment. He allowed O'Connor's words to remain exactly as they were, harsh, definitive, and unresolved. By the time of his death, O'Connor had already endured deep personal tragedy, most notably the suicide of his son, Hugh, in 1995. That loss reshaped his public life, steering him toward advocacy and compassion. Yet even then, he never revisited his feelings toward Reiner. The silence between them had solidified into permanence. Reiner moved on, continuing his career and rarely speaking of O'Connor again. O'Connor, meanwhile, left behind a record that required no clarification. He had said what he meant while alive, and never took it back. In the end, the most unsettling truth may be this: some conflicts do not resolve. They do not heal. They simply outlive the people who carried them. And that silence becomes the final word. So the question lingers long after the credits roll. Was Carroll O'Connor defending artistic integrity? Or did personal pride transform a professional clash into a lifelong feud? And was Rob Reiner's silence an act of dignity or avoidance? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if stories like this reveal a side of Hollywood you've never seen before, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the truths that were never meant to be spoken out loud.